Good day, everyone. Richard Cowperthwait for Northwest Access TV. I can't even tell you where we are here. Northwest Access TV, thank you for joining us. Happy to have for a second show, retired Vermont Judge Greg Rainville. Greg, good to see you. Thanks for coming back for a second show. I trust at least some of our viewers have already seen that first show, covered a lot of your background. Again, just strikes me as a classic case of a local boy who made very, very good. Again, Greg, of course, became a Vermont judge. We'll be talking a lot about that, but grew up in Franklin County on a farm in Franklin, had I guess, kind of a dream to go to law school, pull that off, or become a lawyer. Graduate of UVM, University of Toledo Law School, came back to Franklin County, ended up buying the family farm, and I think we left the last show after you had sold the family farm and decided to focus on lawyering and started working for Ted Tyler. Right. And of course, the story I love about Ted Tyler, who I haven't seen Ted for a while, but great guy, but I loved it. I think Ted was maybe one floor above you in your Main Street office, and Ted, of course, is the Franklin County Republican Committee chairman, and Greg here is the Franklin County Democratic Committee chairman, but I guess that...
In the 80s, yes.
In the 80s, but yes. That's pretty funny. So I think that's where he left you, so at that point you're kind of focusing on lawyering. So where to judge? Were you already thinking of becoming a judge at some point? At that time, Greg, or was that a little later?
No, farthest thing from my mind at
really?
That time.
Just happy to be lawyering, and maybe...
I was very happy to be a trial lawyer, which is what I'd gone to college for.
Right.
Took courses such as theater and English and creative writing, and was on the debate team.
Right.
And, tried to prepare myself as much as I could to be a trial lawyer. Huh. And that's all I was really focusing on in the 80s, 90s.
And there are plenty of lawyers who, being a trial lawyer, is the last thing they'd want to be.
Last thing they want to do, right.
And probably most lawyers, the last thing they'd want to be is trial lawyers, or?
There is a lot of stress,
yeah.
And it's a high-pressure situation. A lot of work that different lawyers do.
Yeah.
Can be stressful and high pressure, but particularly when you are preparing a trial, working with juries. But it was something that I liked doing,
right.
And I liked addressing people, being able to persuade them to a particular viewpoint, if it was a credible viewpoint. So it wasn't until many years later when I had gone in as an acting judge to cover for a judge who was absent for some period of time doing small claims cases, and that was 2005. Oh. So I'd been practicing for 22 years at that point. For a
long time.
Right. And all of a sudden a light went on in my head that,
really?
Gee, I kind of like this.
So again, not till about 2005 or so?
Right, late 2005.
Really?
And in fact, I had sat on the environmental board as an alternate member of the environmental board, and we would go all over the state.
Anything to do with the Walmart rejection here?
No, no.
That brings
I was not
brings
part
to
of
mind
that.
Walmart.
Yeah, no, I was not part of that. So I was on that board for 5 or 6 years.
Huh.
So you kind of sit as a quasi-judicial member.
Yeah.
There was a 9-member board at that time. Huh. You're making decisions, you're hearing evidence, you're working with people, it's testimony.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat similar, but it wasn't the same as being the sole decision maker that someone sitting on the bench was.
Yeah.
And also, I always liked a flexible schedule. I still was farming on the side, had beef cattle, and was doing chiggering. And if it was a nice day, the sun was shining, I'd like to be out in the woods or on a tractor haying. Pounding posts, picking stones, whatever.
So you never gave up farming totally?
No, I never did.
No,
never
good
did.
For you.
And of course, when you're on the bench, it's a very rigid schedule.
Right.
And so there were several reasons why I really hadn't considered it, and it just all of a sudden one day, it kind of came together, probably subconsciously more than anything else.
Really?
And then got thinking about it and decided to apply, and I happened to get in the first time.
Wow, that's
numerous
impressive.
people apply, and it takes a few times to get in. But we didn't have a judge in Franklin County at that time in 2005.
There was no judge, or?
Judge Kilburn had been the last
Okay.
judge from Franklin County.
Okay, no
And
judge.
he had retired.
No judge from Franklin County.
No judge from Franklin
Okay.
County. Exactly. And I'm sure that helped.
Okay.
And
Jim
of
Douglas,
course, now
of
that
course,
I've
is
retired, we're back to not having a judge
Right.
who resides in Franklin County
Right.
on the bench.
And of course, the governor then, Republican Jim Douglas, and Franklin County treated Jim Douglas pretty well over the years, so
Oh,
I
yes.
suspect that probably meant something to him. Hey, we should probably have a Franklin County judge, huh?
And interestingly enough, he appointed two people that had aligned themselves with the Democrats. I was always someone who voted more for the person
Right.
than the party line, but was primarily, as you said, was chair of the Democrats for a period of time, and
Yeah.
have always been more aligned that way. So Judge Robert Bennett from St. Johnsbury was appointed at the same time I was,
Okay.
and he was well-known Democrat from that corner.
Huh.
So the governor appointed two people who were affiliated with the Democratic Party primarily,
Interesting.
even though he was a Republican governor, but he was a very moderate
Yeah.
Republican. Judge Bennett used to call us the Saints, not because we were, but because we both came from either St. Albans or St. Johnsbury. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
And again, appointed judge in 2006 or a little?
2006, I got sworn in St. Patrick's Day.
Really, 2006?
Yes,
Interesting.
right.
Wow. Were there times, again, you were judge for a lot of years, obviously, were there times the old be careful what you wish for, especially early on, or I'm sure there's talk about a big learning curve. It takes a while to, I guess, get comfortable, but pretty early on, were you pretty comfortable that this was a good decision, good move?
I was very fortunate in that respect.
Yeah.
And once I made the decision, I'd always felt right,
Yeah.
and I adapted pretty quickly. It's a tremendous learning curve.
Yeah.
You're going night and day. You don't have any staff. You do have some training available to you that's helpful, but the real training comes with on-the-job experience, and
Yeah. And when you
that takes time.
When you say no staff, obviously there's court staff, but meaning no one particularly, no one assigned to you?
Yeah, judges don't have secretaries. We don't
Okay.
have administrative
So
assistants.
you literally don't have staff?
We literally do not have staff.
That's right. Is that unusual? Do most states, do judges have staff, do you?
In some states, they have secretaries. In some
Really?
states, they hire their own law clerks.
Really?
In Vermont, we share law clerks. 3 or 4 or 5 judges will share a law clerk.
Really?
The law clerk that sits in Franklin County also covers Grand Isle,
Huh.
and that law clerk is stretched pretty thin.
I bet.
And so, yes, you do have that backup, but you have to be very careful. It's a scarce resource.
Wow.
So you're left pretty much on your own. And there were more resources when I first went on the bench. There were people to assist with computer issues.
Huh.
We had people called power users who were in each courthouse. So if you had a software problem or a hardware problem, you could go to that person. They had a little more training than the average staff person, and they could get us going in the right direction. That's no longer available.
Huh.
They also, there's a central help desk
Yeah.
that we can call
Yeah.
that can help us, but there's no one there present in the courtroom. At one time, there were also administrative people who could do some typing for us. Judges now have to do all their own typing. They really loaded up judges with a lot of administrative duties,
Huh.
and that seems to be more and more that way as time goes along.
And I would guess that doesn't strike you as a good way to go. Sounds like you folks have enough stuff to do
You
with
would
that.
never design a system that way
Really?
if you had a choice.
Yeah. Interesting. How many, again, you might have mentioned this before, how many judges in Vermont? Say 35?
About 35.
Really?
They added a judge last year in July. The legislature did, and I think we were at 34, and that makes it 35.
Huh.
There are a couple of magistrates that have been added as well.
Huh.
So Ideally, you would have 38 or 40.
Yeah.
Ideally, you would have 1 or 2 judges always available to cover any particular county if a judge was on vacation or a judge was sick or a judge had to take leave for some reason.
There had to be recused because of some kind of a conflict or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we don't have that luxury. We
Really?
do have the ability to bring in retired judges who are willing to serve. A lot of them, once they're retired, they're finished.
Right. Howard Van Benthuizen comes to mind. Howard still does some
Judge Van
cases.
Benthuizen still does some. The problem is you're operating at such a level, it's almost akin to being an Olympic athlete. I mean, you learn to process information very quickly.
Yeah.
You're dealing with a lot of personalities, both staff-wise and people that appear in front of you as attorneys.
Yeah.
And you have to know the inner workings of each particular courthouse, which varies from county to county. Yeah. Excuse me. And so if you're not working pretty steadily, you lose that efficiency. So one of the things that retired judges have noted is that they can certainly come in and cover almost anything, but they're not going to be operating at the same level or as quickly as a judge that's there every day and has that rhythm and has the inside knowledge as to what's going on.
Yeah. Craig mentioned this. My old friend, the late great guy, Steve Wexler, comes to mind. But
Yes.
Vermont, I think, one of the only states where you can become a lawyer in Vermont by not going through law school, by clerking.
By clerking.
And I guess Steve comes to mind, I think.
Steve Wexler was one, Justice Skoglund
Oh, really?
had studied,
Interesting.
did not go to law school. She was raising children at the time
Wow.
and clerking. Did her clerkship. I think she did a 4-year clerkship.
And you have to do a clerkship for like, what, 3 or 4 years or something like that?
It's, at one time, it was a minimum of 20 hours per week for a 3 or 4 year period.
Wow.
And then there was some additional, you still have to pass the bar exam.
Right.
Not only is Vermont unique in that regard in terms of being able to study for the bar exam.
Yeah.
Ideally, if I was going to recommend it to someone, I would say go to law school
Yeah.
for 1 year,
Yeah.
get the formal training for a year,
Yeah.
and then do the clerking thereafterwards where you can at least earn some money
Yeah.
as opposed to giving up income for 3 years while you're in law school and paying out a lot of money
Right.
for tuition.
Right.
There are some online law schools now as well.
Huh.
So that's helpful. So I started to say Vermont was unique in that you can clerk, study for the bar. We also are unique. I think we're the only state that has assistant judges.
Okay, then the assistant side judges.
Assistant side judges, yeah.
Interesting. Yep, I saw Judge Goslin just the other day, in fact. Yeah, no, that's always struck me as kind of a interesting, kind of a cool thing. And I'm hearing from some of the side judges who have known over the years, some of the presiding judges, I guess, very different opinions.
Oh, yes.
Some probably the last thing they want to deal with are a couple of side judges who can actually outvote them, of course, correct?
Can,
in some
yes.
cases.
Yes.
Interesting. Have you feared okay with side judges?
Yeah, I was always able to work out whatever differences
Yeah.
of opinion we had.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It's true. It can be a little bit of a political endeavor when 3 people are hearing the same facts and have very different viewpoints.
And of course, side judges are not dealing with criminal cases.
They're not. They're dealing with family cases. They're dealing with cases involving protective orders where someone's trying to get a relief from abuse order or a stalking order.
Yeah.
And they can be quite helpful in that regard.
Yeah.
They do bring a local perspective.
And was that the early thinking behind it, to have side judges, folks who could give the presiding judge kind of a local perspective, kind of know the
Absolutely.
local terrain?
Absolutely.
And that can indeed be helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting.
If it's a legal question, a question of law, then the presiding judge gets to make those decisions.
Right.
But if it's a question of fact,
Yeah.
Was it light red? Was it light green? Making decisions, particularly about parents and child custody issues.
Yeah.
Who should receive custody, or should it be shared custody? Should the custody order be modified at some later date because of circumstances that have changed with the parties? They really can be quite helpful in that regard. And so I found assistant judges to be more helpful than I did to be an impediment.
Yeah.
Different judges feel differently about that, of course.
Yeah.
You have to be pretty strong-willed and an independent thinker in order to make the amount of decisions that we have to make in a day's time.
Yeah.
And so we become accustomed to processing information, simulating that information, reaching conclusions
Yeah.
based on facts or based on law by ourselves. And so it takes a mental adjustment when you have a committee of three
Yeah.
that has to make that decision.
And the side judges typically are not lawyers, although they can be. In fact, actually, Joel Page is
Joel Page in Lamoille.
Of course, a longtime prosecutor in Lamoille County, and now I think
Yes.
still a side judge.
Yes.
But that most side judges aren't lawyers.
Most are not. Most are lay people.
Yeah.
But they tend to be people who are well-read and are receptive. They do receive training.
Yeah.
So they don't just walk in off the street and start making decisions.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, it's a majority decision. So many times what happens is one of the assistant judges will agree with the presiding judge.
Yeah.
And so that becomes a decision. Where it becomes interesting is when both assistant judges have fairly strong opinions,
Yeah.
which are different than the presiding judge. And I have had that happen.
I was going to say that did happen to you.
It did happen to me maybe 3 or 4 times, but that was it in all the years I was on the bench.
Huh.
And there's only one time I can remember issuing a split decision. And it was not a lengthy process. It was a question of fact.
Huh.
And I viewed it one way, and the assistant judges viewed it another way. Typically what will happen, if there are different viewpoints, we discuss it, just like a jury would.
Yeah.
And so we probe each other as to what we're basing our opinions on,
Yeah.
and can usually come to a consensus. It's rare that you don't come to a consensus.
Yeah. Interesting. So again, you're on the bench, 2006, but you got
Correct.
off to, you felt pretty comfortable. That's funny. I guess I was thinking you had probably wanted to be a judge for years, but it came up. Interesting.
Came up rather quickly.
Huh.
The fact that I was a trial judge, I think, or a trial lawyer
Yeah.
before I became a trial judge,
Made it kind of
made a tremendous difference because I was accustomed to being
Right.
not only in the court
good point.
frequently, but also being in front of a jury frequently.
Right.
And so that part of it was very helpful. Although I have to tell you that it's sitting over there and sitting over here,
Yeah.
very, very different viewpoint.
I bet.
And that takes some getting used to. And just the sheer volume of the workload, you don't have a time to sit back and put your feet up on the desk and think about things too much. It's rapid fire information coming to you,
Yeah.
and you have to deliver decisions oftentimes with nowhere near the amount of time spent on the case that you really would like to spend.
Yeah. The numbers
But that's the way the job works.
Going back to my reporting days, I would typically for years show up in district court in St. Albans on arraignment Monday, and 30, 40, maybe even 50 arraignments.
Right.
Just the volume is just unbelievable. You got any wicked rough stats? The Franklin County State's Attorney's Office pending cases. Are we talking like maybe a few thousand or so? We're talking. Just a lot of cases here.
Yes. So Franklin County typically will, in the criminal division,
Talking criminal.
will process 13, 14, 1,500 cases a year.
Wow.
During COVID, of course, they weren't moving through anywhere near that many.
Right.
Biggest reason is because we weren't able to conduct jury trials. We couldn't put that many people in close proximity
Yeah.
in one room
Yeah.
for health reasons.
Yeah.
And the air handling systems weren't designed
Wow.
to move the volume of air that was necessary to purify the air.
Yeah.
They've improved that a lot since that time, but they still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
So and the problem is when you don't have the ability to conduct jury trials,
Yeah.
then you don't have the ability to bring a case to a head. So out of 1,500 cases filed in a year, excuse me, you might conduct 8, 10, 12, 15 jury trials in a year.
Yeah.
So that's a very small percentage of the total cases.
Right.
So it's not that a lot of cases actually go to trial,
Right.
but once or twice a month you would have what's called a pretrial conference
Right.
day, and we would process somewhere between 60 and 125 cases in one day.
In one day.
One day. So you're calling the case up. You have the state's attorney, you have the defense attorney.
Wow.
The case, at that point, it would be 6 months to 2 years old.
Wow.
They had been working on it for a long period of time. There may have been some negotiations to try to settle the case.
Yeah.
But of course, everybody makes the tough decisions at the last minute.
Wow.
And the last minute is on the day that you have to draw a jury.
Wow.
And so both the state and defense counsel have to make tough decisions about what's the best deal they're going to be able to make and how triable is the case. Do they have the witnesses? Do they have the facts on both sides?
Wow.
There are a lot of considerations, and for a defendant who's charged with a serious crime, even charges that the typical person wouldn't think was that serious, maybe a fish and game cases, case, those can be very contested, and we tried a fair number of fish and game cases over the years because people lose their hunting rights,
Yeah.
and that's near and dear to people for good reason.
Yeah.
So when it came time to make a decision, are you going to get this case settled, and if so, what are the specific terms of whatever the agreement is? Those have been worked on over the 6 months or 2 years that the case has been in court, but they never get finalized. They never really get right down to brass tacks until you have the threat of having to draw a jury and letting a jury make a decision.
Right.
And so that's where the rubber meets the road.
Wow.
And that's where the last minute plea bargaining and deals are made.
Right. And I know
It's
a lot-
jury drawing day.
Right. A lot of people go, get upset about plea bargains and stuff. I mean, good luck if there weren't mostly plea bargains here. I mean, if every case was going to go to trial, I mean, forget it. I mean, my
System
broad
would fail.
question is the criminal justice system still keeping its head at least barely above water? But, geez.
It's gaining.
Yeah.
We are getting closer to pre-COVID
Yeah.
numbers.
And COVID, as you said before, just really messed you up big time.
Well, we shut down the court system March 15th, give or take.
Wow.
And we really didn't start. We started processing cases again. We always did the emergency cases that had to be done. But we really didn't gear up again for close to a year.
Wow.
And then it would really, so we went from 2020, March of 2020, when things really slowed down, started gearing up gradually over the course of a year. It really wasn't until September of 2022 that we brought people back into the courtroom as opposed to appearing remotely by WebEx on a screen,
Jeez.
and started conducting jury trials again. And so there was a lot of catch-up work that had to be done.
Yeah.
And the court system was already very busy prior to that.
Right.
So it's been a process.
Boy, the numbers are just kind of mind-blowing to me. Boy. And again, we talked before, again, judges are rotated around, and you spend a lot of time in Chittenden County, but mostly
Right.
northern Vermont. They typically wouldn't send you down to Windham or Bennington County, typically.
When we're sworn in as judges, we're given a region
Okay.
to work in.
Yeah.
And my region was this northwestern region, which included Grand Isle, Franklin County,
Yeah.
Caledonia County.
Well, Caledonia doesn't exactly strike me as northwest.
Well, it's more northeast.
Yeah.
But I only spent a little bit of time up there. Usually I was either in Newport, which is Orleans County,
Yeah.
Hyde Park, which is Lamoille County.
Yeah.
I did go to Addison County, to Middlebury.
Yeah.
But most of my time was spent either here in Franklin and Grand Isle
Yeah.
or Chittenden County.
Right.
Although I spent quite a bit of time in Newport as well.
That's right. So never made it to Essex County, Guildhall, where my old friend Vince Saluzzi, still the state's attorney.
No, never made it. In fact, I've not seen the courthouse.
No, is that right?
It's quite a trip from here.
Yeah.
Probably would be 2.5 hours to get there.
Yeah, interesting.
Newport was an hour and a half
Yeah.
in the wintertime,
Yeah,
going over the mountain each way.
yeah.
So
And
that
again-
added to the day.
Wow. And again, obviously different staff, so could it be a very different ballgame depending on what court you're in, just with how things would be processed or how fast cases would move along, or?
There's always, excuse me, there's always a local element.
Yeah,
Some of it has to do with, the staff by and large in each of these courthouses are very hardworking people.
yeah. Of course, I know some of the folks locally who have done a great job, or
Right.
just in my reporting days, made my life a whole lot easier.
And so in terms of competence level,
Yeah,
the level of competence of the court staff is fairly consistent from county to county, but of course you have different personalities that you have to learn.
sorry.
What works in terms of the bar in each county is different from county to county.
Yeah.
They get used to a certain way of handling cases or certain protocols in the courtroom. And we do have what's called local rules, which the
yeah.
presiding judge can formulate some rules about attendance and about witnesses and things like that. And some of those change from county to county. For instance, when we started back up after COVID, some judges were much more insistent about the attorneys and or the parties coming to the courthouse again as opposed to participating remotely.
Yeah.
So that varied from county to county.
Yeah,
So you have those differences. And so basically the way we're set up is every September we are assigned our rotation. So you rotate into another county, hence rotation,
yeah.
which is a fairly controversial aspect.
And for how long? Is this a set amount of time all the
Well,
time?
you're assigned there for a year.
Really?
But, for instance, I spent 3 years back-to-back in Franklin County, but I was in civil court 1 year. I was in family court a second year. I was in criminal court the third year.
Interesting.
So I was moving around different divisions,
Yeah,
but staying in the same county.
yeah,
Chittenden County, there were a couple times when I spent 2 years back-to-back in the criminal division. That, even though I was a civil judge, I practiced civil litigation. I'm sorry, attorney.
okay.
So I practiced mostly civil litigation as an attorney. When I first went in, I was doing a lot of civil work as a judge,
As opposed to
to criminal or family or juvenile work.
Okay,
And then gradually, you get in some jurisdictions, for instance, Hyde Park, Lamoille County.
yeah,
You have one judge,
yeah.
handle everything.
Wow.
A lot of civil litigation comes out of Stowe. You have a lot of family work there, divorces, parentage cases. You have a lot of juvenile work, and you have a fair amount of criminal work as well. So the one judge is stretched thin, to say the least. They did start bringing in 1 or 2 days a month a judge from another county to come in and handle just the civil work, which really took quite a load off the presiding judge. So if you're in one of those counties, which is a multi-jurisdictional county, it's not like being in Costello Court in Chittenden County where you're assigned just a family court or just a juvenile court or just a criminal court. Although, even though I was a criminal court judge, I was sometimes covering in juvenile court, family court, whatever.
Yeah,
But when you're in Hyde Park or Grand Isle, or Addison County down in Middlebury, you are the judge and you cover all divisions.
Right, wow.
So it's a lot to it.
Well, it sounds like it. But these are good years. You look back on, it's what you wanted to be, what you pulled off, but you look back, and again, you haven't been out of your judgeship too long, but these were good years.
Very good years.
Yeah.
Difficult years because of the pressure and the stress. It took me 3 weeks after I retired to get back to feeling like,
I bet.
I was a normal human being again and didn't need 10 hours of sleep, just to get caught up.
Right. And you're not.
It was really nice not to get the night calls.
Right. And again, you're not going to be doing any more judge work. We mentioned Howard Van Benthuizen.
Right.
You've had enough of that.
I'm retired. I am moving on to something else.
Okay. Well,
but I can't imagine having done anything else during those 18 years.
Really.
I really liked private practice when I was an attorney.
Yeah.
Some attorneys just kind of slog through it, and it's an occupation. It was much more than that to me. I lived it and breathed it. I really liked it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as a judge, you have much more ability to make decisions and get things accomplished.
Yeah.
And of course, we have tremendous influence over people's lives.
Yeah.
And I'd like to be the person that was making those decisions.
Yeah.
So decision making was something I always liked doing. I like resolving conflicts.
Yeah.
Let's do it that way.
Yeah.
Even though I was a litigation attorney, I like resolving conflict rather than creating conflict.
Yeah.
And as a judge, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to resolve conflicts, whether it's conflict in a family court matter or a criminal court matter or whatever it is. And that brought me a lot of satisfaction.
Well, you're dealing, it's just one of the many jobs, talk about not being able to imagine being a judge, one of the gazillion of jobs I couldn't imagine. Were you able to move on? It just seems like I'm just very indecisive about some things. I can't imagine, gee, why did I make that decision? I trust you make a decision and you move on.
You have to.
Are there some, you must have to. Are there any cases now you looked back on with regret, or it sounds like you just can't spend much time doing that. You got to move on, huh?
If you are a perfectionist, or you're someone who has to mull over decisions for a period of time,
sounds like not a good job for you.
Not a good job. It's something, either decisions that I'd like do-overs on, for sure.
Yeah.
Always. And that's one of the other things you have to get used to as a judge.
Yeah.
Because we make so many decisions, you're not always going to be right.
Yeah.
No matter how hard you try or how much research you do, how much thinking you give it, they're just plain too many decisions that have to be made, and sometimes on the fly.
Yeah.
But if you spend your time with regrets, you're never going to get the job done.
Yeah. Again, with any trials, I assume any conviction, just about any conviction would be appealed by the defense lawyer, or not the case. You'd always have an appeal, obviously, like in a murder case, if there was a conviction. Correct?
There's an automatic appeal in a murder case.
Yeah. How did you fare with appeal? Obviously, you had plenty of cases that were appealed. Did you fare pretty well when it went to the Supremes?
I was pretty typical.
Yeah.
That's another thing you have to get used to as a judge is having a Supreme Court look at the same case and make a different decision.
See it differently.
Sometimes it's a fairly novel issue, and so you don't have a lot of precedent to work with, other cases that are similar with prior decisions.
Yeah.
Or it may be a case that Supreme Court has never heard before. There have been plenty of decisions who come out of different jurisdictions, county by county, and some of those decisions are adverse to each other. So some judges may see it one way, some judges may see it another, and it takes the Supreme Court to finally put a stamp on it and say, this is the way we're going to handle this particular issue.
And the appeals all go to the Vermont Supreme Court.
Vermont Supreme Court.
Okay.
It's rare that any appeal will make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a very narrow window for that to happen. And the vast majority of cases are not appealable to the U.S. Supreme
Did
Court.
any cases you were involved with end up at the U.S. Supreme Court?
Not that I'm aware
Not
of.
that you're aware of.
Not that I'm aware of.
Interesting.
And in a year's time, I mean, I might hear 20, 25 cases a day.
Wow.
So you're looking at anywhere from 75 to 125 cases per week.
Wow.
400 or 500 cases a month. Besides, we're making decisions on cases that don't go to full hearings. They don't have evidentiary hearings. So there are jury trials where jury hears the fact. But we spend an awful lot of time conducting hearings on various issues. And we have to write decisions about those. It might be someone who has conditions of bail that they want modified. They want the curfew changed, or they want something that might be a condition they can't drive because they're facing a DUI third or fourth or fifth or sixth.
Yeah.
So we might have a condition where they can't operate a motor vehicle. And they might petition the court after some period of time to loosen that condition up. That's just one of the areas that we might hear. In civil cases, when you're on a civil docket, there are a lot of motions. And that's what people don't see judges doing. What they see us is when we're on the bench and we're taking evidence or we're making decisions. That's the public side of things.
Right. Which is a tiny part of your work.
It's, unless you're conducting arraignments.
In most cases.
Or you're doing pretrial hearings, spending an awful lot of time wading through motions that are coming to the court, have to be decided by the judge.
Yeah.
So I spend a lot of time either writing or reaching conclusions and publishing those in some written fashion.
Yeah.
And that's what the public doesn't see. So that's a big part of what we do.
Sure. Greg, I know in some cases, I guess I'm not even sure about Vermont, but at least some states you can have a trial by the judge and not by a jury. Do folks have that option in Vermont or
They
not?
do. They do.
In a criminal case, in any cases?
Right. So, excuse me, in order for that to happen, a defendant would have to waive his constitutional right to a jury trial.
Right.
And that happens, partly because it's much quicker, it's much less expensive. Sometimes it's an issue that involves many issues of law, and judge is going to be making those decisions anyway. Excuse me, I have a frog in my
You have
throat.
enough water there? I didn't touch my water.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Okay?
Thank you.
Haven't touched that.
I appreciate it. And sometimes, when people are waiting for their turn to have a trial, they can wait a long time. They can wait 2 years, 3 years.
Wow.
They might be in jail for many months while they're waiting that. And so there are certain people who choose to have a judge make that decision rather than a jury. Not many, but there are some.
Yeah. Interesting. And you had some trials that that there was no jury. You were the
Right.
the
Right.
key guy, obviously.
In civil court, you have a lot more trials where there's no jury. They waive their right to a trial by jury.
Yeah.
It might be a landlord-tenant case. It might be a boundary dispute case, contract dispute. And so many times those involve complicated fact patterns that it's just easier to present it to a judge than it is a jury.
Yeah. Let's talk about Governor Scott in his budget address the other day got into, again, I wake up to the WVMT folks, and I can pretty much count on just about every morning the host just going crazy about criminal cases where Joe Blow or Jane Doe gets arrested for the umpteenth time and released on conditions. And I guess the governor got into that in his budget address and even mentioned a Franklin County case. I think a woman who had been charged, a bunch of times and stuff, kept getting released on conditions. But you want to, I'm sure some people, when they hear stuff like that, what is wrong with our judges? Are judges the problem? Are they the least of the problems? Or can you talk about that? That's just I guess accountability is the big word here.
Yeah.
Yeah, not like it's
Well,
a new
as
issue. It just
usual-
seems to be coming to the fore more these days.
Yeah. So the issue is multifaceted.
Yeah, sure.
It's not just the judges.
Sure.
The legislature has loosened up many of the penalties. They have taken away from judges the ability to set bail.
In fact,
or
same
to
thing
set
happened
substantial bail.
in New York. Didn't the same thing happen in New York? And I think some of the good
Yes.
folks in New York are looking to try to go back on that or something.
Right. The legislature here in Vermont
Yeah.
a couple of years ago, in misdemeanor cases, with some exceptions, but by and large, $200 bail is the maximum that a judge can set.
Really, this is the max. So this is the legislature, nothing to do with judges.
This is legislature.
Wow.
Okay. And while the parameters of that have not been really litigated to the full extent, one of the issues I ran into was people would come into court, they had several cases pending. They might be larceny, they might be petty theft. An awful lot of drug-related crimes were being committed to fund the drug addiction, including thefts at Lowe's and Home Depot and some of the big Marshalls and some of the big
talking
department stores.
Shoplifting's become a huge issue.
Well, they got worse than shoplifting. They would walk in with a cart, fill it up with $1,500-1,800 worth of cordless drill guns and chainsaws and things like that, generators, and just walk out the front door.
Wow.
And I started setting bail in a lot of those cases. Now, the thing about bail is it's not punishment because the people haven't been adjudicated guilty yet.
It's to ensure future court appearances, correct?
Future court appearances, risk of flight.
I think a lot of people are not aware. Why didn't the judge set a lot of bail on this person?
I mean, there are situations where a person may have several convictions, but they always show up for court.
Right.
So unless it's a violent crime, you're really not allowed or given the authority to set bail if they are appearing in court regularly. It's those, but if they have a lot of pending cases as opposed to a lot of convictions, if they have a lot of pending cases, the potential penalties add up over time. And the Supreme Court has found that you can add up the potential sentences, and that can be one of the elements of making a decision to set bail.
Habitual offender comes to mind for what is it, like 5 felonies or something? They can be put away for a long time, depending on.
We don't see many habitual offender
I dealt with a
cases.
few of those cases, but I'm
There are
not sure I
few.
remember anybody ever getting nailed with being a habitual offender.
It's charged from time to time, but it's usually
Typically doesn't hold up in the
it
end.
doesn't hold up in the end. Something's usually negotiated.
Yeah.
So I got an awful lot of pushback as a judge
Because you were
in the last few years because I was one of the few judges that was really insisting.
to have bail on some people.
People had a lot of failures to appear.
Right.
They had a lot of cases pending. There were frequent flyers, is the word that people use from time to time. They'd walk into court with $200 cash in their pocket because they knew that was the going rate.
Really?
And they'd be back out and they'd be back in, charged again. Not everybody, of course, but there were a number of people who fit that category. They were just constantly being charged, constantly in the courthouse, constantly being released, and then they're back in again. And it's highly frustrating for the business owners, highly frustrating for law enforcement. And different judges have different perspectives on it, and they're all reasonable perspectives. I was one of the more conservative judges in terms of cash bail. I'm not that conservative as an individual. But when it came to crimes and bail and people not abiding by court orders, constantly violating conditions of release, constantly accruing multiple charges, it was creating a huge problem. And so there were times when it was appropriate to set bail. So one of my cases that went up to the Supreme Court had to deal with the statute that was not real specific in terms of if someone appears in court and it's got one docket, but there might be 3 charges.
Yeah.
So is it $200 bail on misdemeanors for the entire docket? Is that the most we could set?
Yeah.
Or was it $200 per charge?
Per charge, or
Well, I
600?
interpreted it as per charge.
Oh,
So if there's 3 charges, it could be $600 bail.
Yeah.
Well, that made quite a difference in whether
Sure.
people were meeting bail or not.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of pushback for good reason, but the public defenders were challenging me on that. Defense attorneys were challenging me on that. And finally, just before I retired, there actually was a Supreme Court decision that said, yes, that's appropriate, $200 per charge.
Per charge.
Per charge.
Must-
But because it's a fairly new statute, as I said, a lot of those issues have not been litigated yet.
Yeah.
And so it was up to the judges, and most judges were taking the conservative interpretation that, well, it's $200 per docket.
Boy, it seems surprising to me that wouldn't have been made clear long ago, but what do I know?
It's whenever you have a new statute, there are always certain angles or issues to the statute that maybe weren't thought about, or they arise, and they have to go to the Supreme Court and have the Supreme Court make a decision.
Yeah. Well, you must get frustrated as now former judge. Again, the cases I mentioned, I'm hearing about some defendants, police. I hear, John Murad, the Burlington chief, saying, hey, we've dealt with this guy forever. What are we supposed to do? I'm hearing even like 100 times for one or somebody, but geez.
Well, it's always a delicate balance between protecting individuals who've been charged with a crime, protecting those rights.
Yeah.
And that's always paramount. You have to protect people's rights. The system does not work well unless people are well represented in court.
Yeah.
And their constitutional rights are not only acknowledged, but are followed.
Yeah.
So it's always a delicate dance, when you are trying to protect the public from public risk of violence or public risk of their house being broken into or their businesses being robbed, things like that. You have that pressure point, and then you have the pressure point of the constitutional rights of the individual in front of you.
Yeah.
And so you're always weighing and balancing, and you can't go too far in one direction or the other.
So for the frustrated public, any words of hope for just folks who just get so incredibly frustrated to hear these kind of recurring stories? That's just kind of the way it is.
I think the pendulum is swinging.
Yeah.
I think that in Chittenden County, for instance, there was a huge push to make the laws more lax.
And the Chittenden County State's Attorney, Sarah George, has certainly come under some criticism from some folks about being too lax, or however you want to put it, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
She is very good about prosecuting with vigor a lot of the violent crimes.
And you've, of course, you've dealt with her
Many years.
Many years.
But there are some other crimes, partly for lack of manpower, partly for philosophical reasons.
Yeah.
They don't push as hard. And, I saw it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So, my opinion on some of those cases was not consistent with her opinion. But I always respected her. She's a smart, hardworking woman.
Yeah.
I just don't agree with her sometimes.
Interesting.
So, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
You might go to another county and they might have a state's attorney, that pushes a little too hard.
Yeah.
And so as a judge, you have to try to balance
Interesting.
that. And I certainly ran into those situations where, it was a little too harsh sometimes, and it just wasn't workable. Sometimes it wasn't fair, I thought. But what's fair to you might not seem fair to me.
Yeah.
And so that's another balancing act that you're always trying to do.
Yeah. Were you reasonably impressed? I suspect the answer is yes, but I mean, you dealt with hundreds, I mean, thousands of lawyers, state's attorneys, just cases over the years. Were you generally reasonably impressed with the quality of the efforts of the lawyers who were in front of you?
Yeah, it's surprising. So that raises a couple of things. One is in terms of who's being appointed to the bench these days, there's a large number of people who have come out of the Attorney General's office or the State's Attorney's office on the prosecutorial side of things in terms of criminal court, but across the board as well. People who have been defense attorneys or public defenders have not been appointed with anywhere near the amount of times. And the interesting thing is that from my experience, and there are a number of public defenders that I've seen who've gone on the bench, and they have been the judges who are much more insistent and much more conservative in their interpretation of the law, more apt to set bail, more apt to be less lenient than the people coming out of the state's attorney's office or the attorney general's office.
It does seem kind of counterintuitive on the surface. Interesting.
I've seen that happen repeatedly.
Really?
And I was having a conversation with someone recently who retired as a public defender, who was a very good public defender, operated in several counties, including Franklin and Grand Isle. And he made that observation. He said,
really?
I would never
That's interesting.
issue a decision like that judge did. He said,
I think that was in part, in a tiny way, they're public defenders and saying, well, people maybe think I'm going to be kind of soft on crime or whatever, and that's the last thing I'm going to, who knows. But that's an interesting point, Greg.
There are people who probably would disagree with that conclusion, but that's the conclusion I formed was, obviously there's some notable exceptions. But interestingly enough, even the attorneys who come on the bench who tend to be more lenient over time often become less so.
Interesting. Boy, I guess you could say the ending of your judgeship probably wasn't exactly the way you would have wanted it to end. You come up for judicial retention, and I know we talked off air. And again, you were running into some criticism, but you think you would have survived that and could have served for another 6 years, although it sounds like you might not have served for another 6 years. But it just sounds like the process left you just a lot less than impressed. Just not as you see it, not a good process for the judicial retention. Again, every 6 years, correct, for a judge?
Every 6 years, yeah. And so the retention process involves several things, one of which is surveys that are sent out to the court staff, surveys that are sent out to attorneys who practice in front of us, and other court officers as well. They are anonymous responses.
So totally all anonymous.
All anonymous.
Okay.
And so there were some people who had, not many, but there were a few people that had pushed back, did not like the way that I had taken a less lenient position on bail and some other factors,
so
right?
The bail issue definitely, was that kind of the biggest issue that they were hitting you with?
They didn't always call it a bail issue, but that was, when I was in front of the retention committee, most of the retention committee members, I thought, were very reasonable and very respectful. There were a couple of members who clearly had their minds made up. I'd not even met them beforehand, and clearly had made up their minds.
And sorry, these are all legislators?
It's a joint committee on retention, so it's both people in the House and people in the Senate.
But all legislators?
All legislators,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And there were a couple of people who came at me really hard for various things,
really?
But one of them, as it turned out, happened to be someone who was sponsoring a no-cash bail bill
Wow.
in the legislature.
Is that right? A no cash bail?
No cash bail.
In any case?
I don't know how broad it was. I did not read it.
Interesting.
I found that out afterwards. I didn't know that going into the hearing. So I took a fair amount of criticism. It's not unusual for a judge to take criticism when you're in front of the retention committee.
Sure.
I mean, their job is to establish whether we're following the law, whether we're doing a good job in court.
Yeah.
But there were a couple of the members who stood out who really had a problem with the way I was conducting criminal cases.
Yeah.
Felt I was being too harsh. And that's fine. You can have that conviction.
Yeah.
But they were a little over the top.
Yeah.
I received some apologies after that, not from them,
Yeah.
but from other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked to.
And I was contacted by a number of people when they found out I was thinking about just pulling my application,
banging it, yeah.
because I'd only plan on being there a short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, and then I was going to retire.
Did you tell those folks that or not? Is that something you told them that you might?
It didn't come up.
Didn't come up.
Didn't come up.
Would you have told if you had been asked that?
Oh, sure.
You would have told
Oh,
them?
sure. I mean, they want to know, I'm going to tell them. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
So I was told by people in the legislature and by other people, don't pull your application, you're fine, you're going to get through the process, but it's going to be a media event, right?
Yeah.
And I was just not going to put my family through that.
Yeah.
There was some press that picked it up, and they were talking about the criticism. They weren't talking about the fact that I had 100% support from the court staff. There wasn't a single criticism.
So I assume you had plenty of supportive comments and stuff, obviously.
Had a lot of. Right.
Wow.
It was, the vast majority is very supportive.
Really?
But the longer you're on the bench, the more people you run into, the more situations you run into, the more times, more opportunity there is to issue a decision somebody's not going to like.
Sure.
And
But you feel you clearly would have made it for another six years if
yes,
you had hung in there.
that's what I was told.
That's what you're told.
Over and over again by supposedly people who had their thumb on the pulse.
Yeah.
But
you
I
just
said, look,
decided enough was enough,
I've been doing this a long time, and some of these folks have their opinions about things. I think it's really creating problems in the judiciary and problems in society, the way they want to go with things. And if that's the way they want to go, that's up to them. They have the power to do that. And I'm not going to spend 3 or 4 weeks being a headline in the newspaper, where it's many times not a balanced story, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear you. So you called it down to about a minute and a half now, Greg. So you called it a day, but boy, 18 years on the bench sounds like it was
It's long enough.
long enough.
It's long enough.
But it sounds like a good 18 years. Sounds like you feel very good about it.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I received a tremendous number of emails and communications from people. I mean, it was overwhelming.
Yeah.
About people who were thanking me for my service, people who respected me as a judge.
Including some people, perchance, who you sentenced? Or?
Even that.
Is that right?
Believe it or not. Believe it or not, yes. So anyway, that is reaffirming that, my biggest thing, try to be fair, try to be reasonable with people. And
Well, I guess as
that doesn't always mean it's going to be popular.
yeah, I guess as a former kind of longtime reporter, I guess I had the same hope in what I was doing. But no, it sounds like you had a heck of a career. Half a minute. What might the future hold? Any? May you get back into lawyering or politics or who knows?
I have several irons in the fire. I've not made any concrete decisions. There are some opportunities if I want to get back into litigation, which I kind of miss.
Yeah.
There are some political things that I'm thinking about. I have a lot of energy, and I just hate to take all this experience that I've put together over the years and just put it to bed without using it. So
It'll be interesting to see what the future holds, but kudos. Sounds like an outstanding career on the bench, and we appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Retired Vermont Judge Greg Rainville. Appreciate our second show with the judge. And thanks to producer Josh Pryor. And thanks for watching us here on Northwest Access TV. I'm Richard Cowperthwait. See you next time.